Hey everybody, what's up? It's Mac McCormick from Big Whiskey Rebellion. We are standing at Maker's Mark where we are about to do a private selection cask.
I always like to put in perspective of what you see in here. So last year alone, we landed right at 2.8 million cases in nearly 120 plus different countries around the world. That's a lot of whiskey. When you think about all that volume and all those cases and all those bottles of whiskey, you look behind me, this is the entire distillery. We have designed and scaled our process in a way to start very, very small, controlling each batch individually, but creating that consistency with each batch as we go through the process.
You guys run 24 hours?
24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It only takes like 5 people to run this whole still house. This is where every drop comes from. It's right here behind me. We use a roller mill, a little bit different than what you'll see at most bourbon distilleries. Traditionally, you're going to see a hammer mill. Hammer mill pulverizes grain to a fine texture like flour. If you do that, you're breaking down every starch in the grain. Sweet, sour, salty, bitter starch. At Makers, we hate bitter. So we use a roller mill, more common in Scotch and Irish whiskey. We're using a combination of 6 adjustable rollers that grinds the grain to a coarse texture. I'll show you a sample of our wheat here, how coarse that grain is, right? It's almost like oatmeal. So by shedding the husk and not pulverizing it, that husk is going to hold on to those things that we don't want. It makes it much harder to force them during the mashing process without pressure cooking. It's also too large for our yeast to ferment those bitter flavors into alcohol. So in turn, leave our mash very sweet, later leave our grain alcohol, very front palate, very mouth-watering as well. It also lowers our corn oil content, which can affect bitterness and things like that too. So as I mentioned when we came in, we only have 3 mash tubs here in the distillery. Low and slow is the name of the game, okay? Just like stew, the longer and slower you cook it, the more mouth-watering, full flavor it's gonna be. We'll basically phase in all 3 grains separately at different temperatures. That's gonna help us maximize the flavor profile. You start with your corn, that's your starch, you bring that to a boil. That's where the majority of your starch is. Phase in your wheat. And then the barley, the enzymes are temperature sensitive. So we're gonna drop that temperature all the way down to about 150, 160. So let those enzymes break down those starch chains, ultimately giving us sugar, okay? At the end of that 3 to 4 hour cook, we've also added water. We've also added sour mash from our previous batches. That sour mash is gonna help with taste consistency, but more importantly, it lowers pH. It gives us a more of an acidic environment for our yeast strain. At the end of that cook, that mash will smell and taste like cornbread, whole wheat bread, or sweet cereal. We'll have nearly 100% conversion from starch to sugar. We chill that mash down to about bath water, 80 degrees. Pump that to our fermenters where it's gonna ferment for 3 full days. In order to ferment, you need 1 key ingredient, yeast. As I mentioned, we don't use any powdered yeast here. We use what's called a jug yeast. It's in liquid form. So if you're familiar with old style baking, brewing, friendship bread, sourdough bread practices, propagation kind of falls along that same model. We store all of it right in here. So the jugs you see here in the back of the cooler, those are inoculated off of our mother strain. We'll then pull little bits off of that jug and grow larger batches for our distillery here. So I'll let you take a smell of this. It's a pretty old one. Take a smell.
Oh wow, it smells like cider.
But if you were to taste it side by side to Blue Moon, it tastes like a flat Blue Moon.
Crazy.
It's almost identical. Cascade hops are an antiseptic. So when you think about old style beer world, you would over hop things to make it sanitary, right? Well, kind of the same thing with our yeast. Those hops are loaded with enzymes, which the yeast feeds on along with sugar, but they're also an antiseptic. So it's gonna protect it from any outside yeast strain. There's yeast everywhere. There's yeast in our hands, there's yeast in the air, there's yeast everywhere. So it will protect our yeast strain from any outside bacteria or yeast that can effectively attack it, get rid of it, ruin it, kill it, whatever. We'll grow a 5-gallon jug of yeast into a large enough supply for 21 fermenters in 2 days. Let's go talk about fermentation. So this here is our fermentation room. In this room is the 8 original fermenters of the distillery, 12 feet deep, 12 feet wide. They're made of all natural cypress. These tanks have been here since 1889. So like they always say, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Now, once a mash is finished cooking, it will stay in 1 fermenter for the full 3-day process. It is 1-to-1 batch-wise. So this one here is a day 2. You'll feel it's a lot warmer.
Oh yeah.
Take a whiff off of it.
trying to place the smell. I know it. Not cornbread, more like a cake.
So at this stage is where you're getting a lot more of your alcohol production.
Right.
What's interesting is we smelled the yeast upstairs, and you get a lot of fruit notes and fatty acid esters and textures and congeners from yeast in fermentation that translate to alcohol. So when you think about what we smelled upstairs and the orange peel notes, the soft wheat notes, you're getting those at the beer stage in the fermentation process. So you'll notice the bubbling is starting to slow down. By the time this is done, this will almost look like really thick oatmeal on top. So it'll be ready to distill. We'll hook up that air hose to a steam line, and the rising air will stir all the cap or cake back into the beer, okay? We'll drain the tank, it goes into a well, and then we'll feed one of our stills in the distillery. At Makers, on average, we're filling about 800 barrels a day right now. Wow. That's a lot of liquid, okay? In reality, on property, we have 3 distilleries. They're just all under the same roof, okay? For the first 50 years of our history, we only ran the setup you see up front here. But as demand grew and the industry grew, we had to figure out how to make more whiskey. So what would have been cost effective, add bigger equipment, increase your recipe, make more volume. The problem is flavor and consistency doesn't always scale with a recipe. So for the first time in 2002 and the second time about 6 years ago, we grew our distillery for consistency, not necessarily volume. By duplicating the original still house we already had just directly behind it, okay? So if you look behind these 2 tail tanks, it looks like a mirror. It's actually another identical set of still and tail tanks. In the very back is another identical set of still and tail tanks. Mash tubs are identical. Fermenters are identical in size and process. We literally just scaled the process, not the recipe.
That makes sense.
Okay? Keeping the whiskey the same, ultimately keeping the process.
Yeah.
Okay? So we'll step back here. All 3 column stills, like you see here behind you, number 2, number 3, number 1's up front, they're all 3 identical. They're 5 stories tall, 100% copper through and through column beer stills. Okay? Through the center of each still, which is 5 stories tall, 36 inches in diameter, down the center of each still, 16 perforated plates, specifically designed to extract flavor in the alcohol. 120 proof, raw grain alcohol right off the mash. Very, very, very broad in smell and flavor and texture. Okay? You want to taste some of it?
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
So this low wine's going to be a little warm, but this is 120 proof distillate right off the mash. When you put your straw in, just because the buoyancy of the alcohol is different than water, put your thumb over the end and then turn it sideways and pull it out. Okay?
It reminds me of like some childhood cereal. I can't think of what it is.
Really grain heavy. It's also really chewy.
Golden grams.
Yeah.
That's what it tastes like. It tastes like golden grams.
Take this low wine, pump it downstairs into a pot still called the doubler. Doubler's going to fine tune the taste, cleans up some of the viscosity, and more importantly, it brightens and refocuses all that grain flavor forward.
Does it bring the alcohol content up when you do that?
Yes. So the high wine condensed into our second tail tank is at 130 proof. Crystal clear, sweet grain alcohol, almost ready to go into a barrel.
Very cool.
Try some of it?
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Okay. It's a lot thinner, it's a lot clearer, it's also a lot cooler. It's 130 proof.
Sweetness changed dramatically.
That's the foundation of everything we do here at the distillery. Front palate, mouth-watering, non-bitter. This is just distillate, right? So the barrel is what's going to mature it into Maker's Mark bourbon. So this is Bonded Warehouse A, oldest, smallest warehouse we have here at the distillery. All of our warehouses, whether it's a small one or a really big one, it's the exact same process, okay? All natural climate, they're traditional rick style. Stay really warm, really dry on the top halves like an attic, really cool, really damp on the bottom halves like a cellar or basement. One thing that's different about the oak on our barrels is how the wood is seasoned. Traditionally, you gotta have dry wood to make a barrel out of. So you'll let it sit out and it'll dry. Over there, traditional drying is like 3 to 6 months, and then it's kiln dried and turned into a barrel. The lumber on Maker's Mark barrels sits out in the weather for a year.
That's what I read, yeah.
What happens if you let wood sit out in the weather for a really, really long time?
I mean, it tends to curl a bit. The wood sugars inside of the wood caramelize naturally, like all kinds of stuff.
So if you think about it like this, if you build a deck on your house and you don't stain it or seal it, it will eventually rot and fall off your house, okay? So that decay does a lot of great things for our whiskey. Number one, it decreases moisture very slowly. Because of that, it's going to leach out tannins. On top of that, as you mentioned, the wood is rotting, so we're degrading those natural sugars. The microflora and the weathering and the oxidation is going to break down those lignans and lactones. It draws them closer to the surface of the oak, making them much easier to access. So we use a light grade 3. It's a 38 to 42 second char, much smoother and softer in texture. Gives us all the color we need, gives us all the sugar we need, gives us just a light toasty complement without driving all that bitterness on the back of the palate. Part of this process, you've done barrels before, a private select barrel in the past, right? So traditionally, we start the tasting, you start with a little sample of castering.
Right.
Typically, we just pour that off of a bottle because it's the foundation to everything. Well, we still have people ask us all the time, well, why can't we just do regular barrels of Maker's Mark as a barrel pick?
Yeah.
And it's always a simple conversation. It's consistent.
Right.
So we figured we're gonna prove the bullshit's real. Rather than just pouring whiskey that's already batched, we're gonna pull whiskey off of one barrel from this warehouse to show you a couple things. Number one, even though we do rotate, every individual barrel can have its own little nuances. But at the end of the day, because of rotation, because of how we age our whiskey, you're not gonna find big variations from barrel to barrel. So this barrel here is just short of 9 years old, so it's a little bit out of our aging window, but it still fits our flavor vision to taste. Okay. The reason why it's older, this warehouse ages a lot slower, so we can let it sit in here a little bit longer, whereas the other ones, it might be a little bit quicker. So we'll pull some whiskey off this,